talking about some of those ideas and seeing if some of them kind of resonate with you, or if they're not things that really are useful or things that don't sit quite right, then feel free to disregard them. So it's not a how to get an academic career, it's sort of knowing a little bit more about the industry and some of the specifics of the Australian system. So this was part of the background that I sent around, which was some of the thinking I did before I enrolled in this course, which was basically I went to university and I learned how to be a scientist, and then I somehow became qualified to be an academic. So although I'd learned like theoretical knowledge and I'd learned technical skills and I'd learned about the practice of researching, I felt like I wasn't really well equipped to navigate a career in a university, whereas in other industries you're trained specifically for that industry, whereas academia trains future participants and leaders by participating in an undergrad or a postgrad degree program, which qualifies you for another industry. So you can become an academic in engineering or in law by the fact that you've done an undergrad and postgrad degree in those fields without any specific training that actually pertains to the industry that you're working in. So I came to this point of realising that I had really very little idea about the place where I was working, how things got done, and the kind of decisions that were being made. And I looked around to see if there was anything that would kind of help me fill that gap, because that was becoming interesting to me and also was presenting a few minor hurdles to the way that I was interacting in my institution. And I found this course, which is an Emerging Leaders and Managers program run out of the University of Melbourne. It's directed at both professional staff in universities but also academic staff. And that was interesting to me because it was providing an understanding of how universities run and the wider context for how those decisions are made. So what's going on in terms of how a university works, but also the external drivers in terms of policy and those sort of things. So these are the higher level things, but it was run in 4 modules that worked through from reflecting on your own career and the way that you work and how you work best, through to understanding how our industry has changed and how it's changing into the future. So in these 3 seminars, I'm going to share some of the things I've learned, and feel free to pipe up. There will be sort of discussion or some examples we're going to work through or questions we're going to talk through. So if anything sounds a bit weird, feel free to ask. So this first seminar is about knowing yourself and understanding the way that you work. So this is kind of the most wishy-washy kind of topic that is covered in my 3 seminars that I'm going to deliver. So the others are a little bit more about understanding how the institution and the sector works. But this one's about thinking about your own way of working. So one thing that I found as I was progressing from my PhD to postdocs was that there was an expectation that I would manage and develop my own career. So even though I had support to do that, I found that really quite difficult at first, because I didn't know what kind of decisions I should be making, and I also didn't feel like I had that I was really empowered to make those decisions, and I found that quite difficult. How would I plan my own career and with no one looking specifically out for me? So this is what most people at a university encounter. There's not really very clear trajectories and not very sort of clear steps and processes like you might have in the public service, for example. So this first seminar is sort of talking through that, and we're going to be thinking through some exercises where you think about what your strengths are, what you value in work and in a workplace, and what your contribution is. And then we'll be going through a few resources to talk about developing a career strategy, which was something that I hadn't thought of at all before I undertook this course, and then ended up writing out a career strategy somewhat skeptically, but I have actually found that really useful at times when I freak out or get a little bit lost about why I'm doing what I'm doing, or if I should be doing what I'm doing, or if I should just give up and become a landscape gardener, which is my fallback career. So we'll talk about whether you're interested in developing a career strategy and how you might go about that. So the first part of the talk will be about developing self-leadership. So this, where I have things in blue, that's sort of something for you to think about, and we'll just take a couple of minutes. So thinking about your own leadership responsibilities in your PhD or your work, how do you think you invest most of your time and energy? Do you invest it in yourself, in your peers, so other PhD students or postdocs, people you're responsible for, if you have any, for example, if you're supervising a summer student, or if you help out undergraduate students, or do you spend most of your time dedicated to people you're responsible to, as in your supervisor, your postdoc boss? So just take a few minutes to think, or a couple of minutes to think about that, or feel free to talk about it at your nodes. Okay, so we just had a quick chat at this end and found that this isn't really a static thing and it changes through time, how you spend your time and energy. So this is a diagram that I've pulled from some of the lecture materials I went through in my course. And a lot of these are from a guy called Dee Hock, who was the CEO of Visa and had some really innovative ideas about workplaces and practices and various industries. And this is what he was suggesting, is that you should spend about 50% of your energy and work time invested in yourself, and actually quite a little proportion of that time invested in people you answer to. So I remember when I did the course, I allocated a lot more time to my supervisor and thinking about what my supervisor wanted, and actually quite a little time invested in myself. And that's sort of reflected in this survey response. So up here, this is a survey response from members of a higher education professional society, so the equivalent of AMOS, but for people who work supporting higher education. And they found that they were spending a lot of their time and energy in the workplace thinking about people who were answering to them and people who were answering who they answered to, and not very much time dedicated to themselves. So this is kind of introducing the idea of self-leadership and how you can't be a leader of others if you aren't thinking about your own leadership and your own, like leadership of yourself and developing a practice where you lead yourself before you lead others. So these are quotes, these references are to some of the readings that I presented that should be on the website. These are entirely optional, just if something perks your interest or you want to have a look at something in further detail to understand some of these concepts that are a bit different from the way we usually think about our work, then feel free to go over the readings or send me an email. But this reading was suggesting that it's important to understand and observe yourself before you can lead others. And that really comes from being aware of your own capabilities and your own interests and strengths. And this really starts with working on yourself, which is what was suggested by this business superstar from Visa, arguing that we should invest more time and energy thinking about ourselves at work than other people. And that one of the best ways that we can understand ourselves and what drives us and how we are working and what we're working towards is through reflective practice. So in terms of reflective practice, these are just some questions to think about for yourself is, are you aware of what you're trying to achieve in your work? And I don't mean really in terms of like where you're going to submit your next paper, but I mean in terms of like if you're doing a PhD, what do you want out of that PhD? Do you want to just get that done so that you can move into an industry role? Are you looking to make a particular impact in the field or in a particular community? So are you thinking about these sort of broader questions about what you're trying to achieve through your engagement with work and what kind of impact you're trying to have? And another really important question to ask is, do you seek feedback on your work practice? So the key word here is practice, not on your work, because we all seek feedback on work when we send a thesis chapter to our supervisor or when we send a paper to our co-authors before we submit it to a journal, but in terms of your work practice. So these are questions for you guys to think about yourselves, but when I was answering these questions doing my course, I had no idea of what I was trying to achieve through my work and what my work meant to me. And certainly in terms of seeking feedback, I would say I actively avoided seeking feedback because I was worried about criticism and worried about what people might say about my work practice, the way I relate to others and the way I engage with my work. So that's introducing the idea of self-leadership and how we need to understand ourselves and feel empowered in our own work and careers before we can lead other people or before we can take on more responsibility and greater roles. So those are two of the readings that I mentioned. If any of those concepts are interesting to you about how that works in practice, feel free to look back at those readings. So one of the key things I mentioned in terms of developing this self-leadership and thinking about yourself as a leader, even if you don't supervise a PhD student or you don't have a postdoc, which most of us don't, where most people are fairly early on in their career. So one of the ideas about the key concepts in terms of thinking about yourself as a leader and thinking about yourself more broadly is about developing reflective practice. So this is another question to think about is, and you can talk about this quickly, is after you've completed a task or after you've been involved with something, so for example, organising a seminar or contributing to a conference or sitting on a committee or any task in your workplace, after you've completed that task, do you ever reflect on it and think about what you've done? And if you do reflect on it, how do you do so? So just take a moment to think about those questions. So one thing I found when I was doing the course was this was not something that I really did. So after, I was just saying to Angus here, after I gave a lecture or a conference talk, I might think to myself, oh, that was okay. I got some questions, so it probably went okay. Or, oh, that lecture, I guess lecture didn't go so well. I felt like I hadn't really prepared enough. So I would give things sort of a cursory assessment, or I'd think about what I was doing, but I never really actually reflected, stopped and thought about what I'd done and how it had gone and why. So this is the idea of reflective practice, which is it's not sufficient just to have an experience in order to learn. So you can't learn and improve just by experiencing something. We have to reflect on that experience, or else we forget it, or even if we don't forget it, we don't learn from it. Any potential learning is lost. And after we reflect on So, for example, I gave the example of giving a guest lecture and feeling like I was a bit ill-prepared, and that's not just a made-up example. I've certainly done that before more than once, and that shows that without reflecting and taking the time to look at those, I wasn't really capable of drawing any generalizations out of those situations, which is this last point that if we do get in the practice of reflecting, we can pull out generalizations and concepts that can help us. And every good concept has to be demonstrated with a schematic. I'm not entirely sure I follow what this one's saying, but it is trying to introduce this idea of, rather than just looking at the results. So, for example, whether the undergraduate students in my guest lecture weren't particularly interested or didn't learn the outcomes that I wanted, and then going back to the techniques. Developing a reflective practice is more about questioning the techniques, the goals and the values. So it's going deeper than just looking at like, oh, that didn't go very well. And this is a really great way to sum up this reflective practice, which is the same as critical reflection. It's a way to make our thinking more visible. So instead of just thinking, oh, I should be better prepared, or I should have spent more time working on my conference presentation, or I've given negative examples, but also the same is useful for positive examples, times when a lecture did go really well or you got really great feedback on a conference. So instead of just thinking about those, by engaging in reflective practice, it's a way to make that thinking visible, and that's what we can learn from. So that's sort of the background to reflective practice. But now I'm going to go through some examples of what reflective practice really is. So reflective practice involves writing down our reflections on a task or an event or an outcome. And I do have an example, a really good example in the readings. I don't know if everyone has access to the readings, because I don't think I can get two screens up, can I? No. But we'll look at that in a minute. So descriptive accounts. So the first step of reflective writing is a descriptive account. So that describes the events as they occurred in a factual manner, and they have a lot of information, a lot of detail. So things like in semester one, I was asked to give a guest lecture to a group of students who are undertaking a course about climate change and policy, and it occurred on this date and there were this many people, and I didn't feel like it went very well. So that's a descriptive account of my event. And the next step is a reflective account. So that is still descriptive to some degree, but this is trying to distance yourself a little bit from the event. So rather than just being like, oh, it didn't go very well, it's starting to try and dig down into the experience and analyse without having me at the centre of that. And we'll go through I'll get up the readings in a minute so we can actually see what I mean by this, and it will all kind of click into place. So that's the next step. So immediately, descriptive accounts are pretty obvious. Like, we could all give a descriptive account of a task that we've done. Reflective accounts are starting to me, seem a little bit different, and a little bit, I was a little bit uncomfortable with that. But the most useful, but also hardest to practice, is a critically reflective account. And that's where we try and look at the issue from multiple perspectives, not just our own. And that's where we do really require some distance from the event. And for example, I might have written down my reflective account of my lecture that didn't go well. And then when we get to the critical reflective account, that might be me looking at my reflection some months later and thinking, okay, well, I was giving this lecture and I didn't feel like it went very well, but I can now see that there's other perspectives on that. My colleague appreciated that I could give a lecture at short notice. most of the students in the class didn't have much of a background in terms of climate science, so they were able to obtain something from it. So that's just one example of how having further distance from the event and not being quite as, I guess, emotional about it, you could see a different perspective and you could get some learning from that. And the learning there might be that you would organise to have feedback on your lecture, or if you felt that you were ill-prepared, your learning might be that even if you're giving a lecture at short notice, you talk to the person who's asked you to, so that you have a clear idea of what they want, and then you can have I could have had a better understanding about what was expected. So this is just an example of me thinking about one event over my past year from this perspective, from a descriptive, a reflective, and then a critically reflective perspective. So this was one thing that was really hammered home in this course I was doing on leadership and management, was the usefulness of reflective habits. And that was a really foreign concept to me. They were suggesting that we should be in the habit of being reflective by keeping a learning log or a diary or daily entries, and making records at the time of what happened, and then going back and trying to pull information out of it. And at first I did this because this was part of the homework, but after a while this did become a habit. And now on Fridays I have an ongoing note in my diary to back up my computer and to do some reflection on that week. And this is a really good chance to try and learn from some of your experiences. And that's just the way that I've organised to do it. And it's been really useful for me. So I'm not suggesting that everyone has to go out and start walking around with a journal where they note down everything that's happened. But this is a good way to think through tasks and outcomes. So that was a fairly loose example I gave, but there is a better example in the readings, which I will just try and get up. So this is an example from the course that I did, and you can take a look at this from in your own time, because this is on the website. But this is basically a story about Marianne, who is a new employee and asked to give a presentation. And the first example is Marianne's descriptive account of her presentation. There's lots of facts. She had to take the agenda. She used PowerPoint, and this is her thinking about her experience of being asked to give this presentation, and that's a descriptive account. But then as we go down, we can see that some time has passed, and Marianne is able to put a bit of distance between her and the presentation, and she's starting to talk about the impact that it had on her. She felt like it went poorly and her self-esteem has suffered, and what she's done since. So this is sort of trying to take her out of the centre of that, with the facts occurring around her, to something that she can learn from. And then the final one example in the readings is her trying to look back at her reflection and undertake a critical reflection of that. And you can start to see that she's looking at different perspectives. So in this story, Mrs. Shaw is her supervisor, and she's starting to kind of understand Mrs. Shaw's perspective, and how, although she felt like this was a terrible outcome in her new job, it wasn't actually all about her, and there were multiple people. So this is just some examples that you can look through if you want to try and understand a little bit more about the difference between descriptive accounts and critical reflections, and why that might be useful. And it might also be useful if you do think that this could help with your learning about your work practice, to think about how you could implement that into your week and whether it would be useful to you. So I said that I had, and it had been really useful to me. And I've also noticed that by doing this and kind of reflecting on other people's perspectives, I'm also a little bit less hot-headed. So, for example, if I thought that someone was criticising me in my work practice, I might be pretty upset about that, and I might not react very well. And although that's probably still the case, by doing these reflective accounts as a regular thing, I've started to realise that as time passes, you see things differently and you can appreciate different perspectives. And that's made me a little less kind of responsive in my work practice at the time. So it's been useful for me, but I don't suggest it's useful for everyone. But it certainly has helped me, not just in terms of my workplace relationships, but also in terms of drawing out learning. So I gave that example of the guest lecture, and I feel like by writing things down at the time and making that thinking visible, it has actually led to me implementing changes in the way that I lecture and the way that things go. So that's another reading in that block, which talks about reflective practice and why it can be useful and how it can be useful. That one's a really good one, so if you are interested, I definitely recommend that. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, as I'm going through this material that I covered in the course and kind of areas that I was pushed into thinking about, was the idea of intelligence, and that's the idea of intrapersonal intelligence. So this is one way to think about intelligence, is that there's lots of different types of intelligence, such as like what we'd have a standard understanding of intelligence, and then intrapersonal intelligence refers to our ability to understand, interpret, control our reaction to other people, places, things and events. So this is very internal. So I was talking about self-leadership, and this is along the same lines. It's the capacity to understand yourself and how you work. And many of the readings that I did for this course suggested that in terms of how we perform at work, your understanding of yourself can be more important than IQ. And I guess in some way that really makes sense. Like in terms of this group that we've got together right now, clearly everyone in this group is highly intelligent and has done very well and is highly successful. So in our work, everyone we encounter has high intelligence in terms of what we'd normally understand, but what can differentiate the way people work is how they relate to others and how they understand themselves. So also included in this idea of intrapersonal intelligence is qualities such as impulse control, persistence, how self-motivated you are, how socially responsive you are to other people, and how empathetic you are. So this is also not something that's fixed. So we can develop our intrapersonal intelligence by understanding ourselves. And we can even see that in the example that I gave, where I used the reflective practice because I was told to as part of the course, but then I did start to notice that it was affecting the way I related to people at the time, and particularly things like my impulse control and getting easily irritated at other people. So we can develop our intrapersonal intelligence, but we have to do that by building our understanding of ourselves. So yeah, in that, returning to that example, I wasn't really aware that I was impulsive until I did that critical reflective practice, and then I started to understand a little bit about myself. So here's some questions for you to take a few minutes to think about. What type of situations push your buttons at work and make you lose your cool or irritate you? Are there certain people or situations where you react more poorly than others? And do you have an idea of where you'd like to build up your own intrapersonal intelligence? So have a little bit of a chat or just to think about that, and then we'll talk about this idea a little bit more. Okay, am I on?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. So it looks like some people had some things to say about that, and I'm sure that there was very different responses to everyone as to, you know, how easily they lost their cool or what kind of situations pushed your buttons. But as I said, every good concept requires a schematic. So here's another schematic of kind of a model of emotional intelligence. And this is just sort of a way to understand that concept of our intrapersonal capabilities as opposed to our interpersonal capabilities. So this is where we understand others and we're attentive to others, and we're good at collaborating and cooperating and all of those things that are fairly highly desired in your colleagues. But in terms of intrapersonal intelligence, that's more about being self-aware, having a good idea of your values and beliefs and what you're trying to achieve at work, and also being aware of how to manage yourself. So what motivates you, and in terms of self-control, understanding those situations that push your buttons or make you lose your cool. So some of the outcomes of developing your intrapersonal capabilities are you can feel more empowered, like I did in terms of managing and developing my own career. You can be less stressed and more resilient to what's happening around you in the workplace. But they're also related, these ideas of intra and interpersonal capabilities, because developing an understanding of yourself can obviously allow you to build and maintain better workplace relationships. So I've talked a bit about your self-awareness, but in terms of self-management, I don't think it'll probably work now because not everyone has a laptop, but here's a couple of things that you can try a little bit later. So one of the big things in terms of understanding yourself and self-management is how you manage time. And this can be also a really important point of conflict in workplace relationships if people have different understandings of time and different relationships to time. So this is an evaluation tool of your time management skills. So this is from a website called Mind Tools that have a lot of kind of surveys and articles and stuff about workplace practice, and some of them are a bit naff, but some of them are pretty useful. So that's something for you to have a look at later and think about how you scored about managing time and whether there's areas you could improve. And for some people that might be that you're not very efficient at managing your time or effective, but for other people it might mean that you're a little bit too bound to time and you're a bit inflexible. And that's one thing that I really learned doing this course was the flip side of being productive and efficient and really focused on time is that you can be quite inflexible, and that can be a real waste of energy, and it can also make it difficult to work easily with other people. So that's one aspect of self-management, and the other is managing stress. So this is another self-evaluation tool on stress management. And this is just a guide to the types of things that might cause you to have increased stress. So just try and take it all with a bit of a grain of salt, but this can help you understand if there's anything in particular that you might be susceptible to in terms of stress. So these are some extra readings or videos if you are interested in developing this type of intelligence, or if you think that this is something that makes sense to you, or things that you connected with in terms of your own capabilities. But the final part of the talk is about developing a career plan. And this was another thing that I wasn't entirely sure about when I undertook my course, because I didn't really see what the point of having a career plan was, when it just seems like no one can make it in an academic career. So it seemed like a bit of a waste and a bit of kind of wishful thinking that would only lead to disappointment. But I have found having this map or structure in place quite useful in terms of guiding me and helping me to navigate times and instances where I've been having difficulties, or I've been lacking motivation, or I haven't been able to see kind of the end point. So the first suggestion for developing a career plan is to begin with the end in mind. So it's useful to know where you want to end up, and you have to do that by conscious design. So you have to plan and consider rather than just leaving things to chance. And the other point for developing a plan is to set specifics and time-limited goals. Even if you don't have an idea of how you're going to accomplish them, and how possible it is to get there. So like I just said, it seems a bit ridiculous. Like every time as a academic you do your performance review and you get asked to submit where you see yourself in 5 years kind of paragraph, it all seems a bit ridiculous, when your contract's 1, 2, 3 years. But this is actually really useful, is to have an endpoint in mind where you'd like to end up, and to set some specific and time-limited goals along the way. And this is a way to focus what's important to you. Overall, a career plan is really fundamental to your self-management. And that's one thing that I did find, even though it seemed like a fantasy, really, it did help me in terms of focusing in on, for example, how I was spending time, how I was making decisions, if I was invited to sit on a committee, or if I was invited to undertake a particular service activity, or various other academic opportunities. It made me be able to focus my thinking about whether that would actually be an opportunity, or whether I wouldn't get what I wanted out of it, and it wouldn't be helping me get to this very far point, this end in mind. So that helped me with my self-management. So here are some resources if you are interested in trying to write out a career development plan. So these are just some basic templates. These aren't specific to academia or higher education. But overall, even if you're not going to write out a career plan and work towards these time-limited goals, it can be really useful to think about your long-term career and how you're developing skills and what you're saying yes and no to, and what you're preferencing in terms of how you allocate your time and energy. So I've got here, it might be helpful to consider, even in very broad terms, whether you would like to stay in academia, whether you'd like to work in industry as a scientist, or whether you'd like to consider other options. And that can really empower you in terms of your own career. When you make that, not necessarily decision, but you make that goal and you're working towards that, then I think you're probably less likely to be influenced by other people and have that kind of uncertainty in terms of managing and planning your own career. So in summary, uncertainty can be really daunting, as I've kind of suggested in terms of my own career plan for an academic career. But at the same time, it can be also really exciting and empowering. There's not one single route to success in academia. Also, I've got noted here that every industry has change and volatility. So we often talk about academia as being really unique. There's a lot of pressure to move around for different jobs. There's not much certainty. People are often on short-term contracts, but that's increasingly the case in every industry. So because there's no ideal academic or no ideal career trajectory, whether you're looking for a career inside or outside of academia, that really creates opportunities. And to take hold of those opportunities, it's really about how you manage change and manage yourself that matters. And that's, in terms of developing the skills to manage yourself in your career, that's some of the things that we've talked about. Developing reflective practice, thinking about your own intelligence, developing a career plan. So the next steps until the next seminar, if people are dialing in for that, is to try and be a little bit attentive to yourself in the workplace, thinking about what motivates you, what you value, and sort of what pushes your buttons or what doesn't. try to be confident in managing your own work style and your own career, because you're really empowered to do that. But if something I've said doesn't gel with you, like the personality types or the reflective diaries, don't stress it. I'm not suggesting anyone do anything or take any kind of thinking about careers off the shelf. Just pick and choose what connects to you. And if something does sound like it would be useful, but it doesn't necessarily slot into your work practice easily, don't stress about that either, because being reflective takes a lot of time and practice, and it's really different kind of thinking to what we do normally. So I persevered with my reflective diaries because I was required to for my course, and it did take a good kind of 6 or 8 months until I felt even a little bit comfortable thinking in that space, rather than feeling like I was just trying to pull words out one by one to write this kind of wishy-washy, touchy-feely kind of reflection each week. So that's kind of broad strokes, but in terms of specifics, if you're interested, review the readings and go through some of those activities and think a little bit more about the way you work. And if you're interested, look at writing a career plan and having that end in mind. Okay, does anyone have any questions or any major objections?
Sophie, can we ask you to turn off your slides so we can see everybody? Because we've only got one screen in here.
Oh, yes, that's a good way to do it.
Hello. Thank you. And I have a microphone if anyone has a question.
Does anyone have a specific question, or does that just need time to percolate? Or was that just like completely different from anticipated? Okay, well that's good. No, that's all good. I'm happy with that. I feel like everyone loves an early mark, and also, it just takes time to kind of think about whether stuff fits with you or if you just think it's kind of a nonsense. Because there's certainly a lot in the readings or exercises that I did that I didn't think made much sense or I didn't think were particularly useful. So things like personality typing, I didn't connect with that when I was doing the reading. So it takes some time to think about what suits you. But please come back. The next one will be in December, and it will be a little more focused in terms of understanding how your institution is structured and where you fit into it, and how decisions get made from university executive right down to being an undergrad student. So come back.
Thank you, Sophie.
Thanks for diving in.
Thank you.